Downward facing dog, Adho Mukha Svanasana, probably the most famous yoga asana out there. And yet one where I see people who've been practicing for decades and still some little sticky spots in there. And I think the reason being that when we repeat something over and over again, we actually cultivate sometimes less spatial awareness around it, not more, because we settle into habits and patterns. So let's look at a few ways that we can help people who are new to this shape start to access it, and a way for those of us that are familiar with the shape to revisit and see what we can refresh. Okay, when you take downward facing dog, thinking about the foundation, you want to have the fingers really spread. This is one of the main things I see, is people having to sort of like half the hand engaged on the floor, or the fingers quite close together. Really spread the fingers wide. Push all of the fingertips, the knuckles. Sometimes teachers talk about this cue of imagining a suction cup under your hand. If that helps you, you can do that. Or you can think about pushing the whole palm in. But the idea of spreading the weight along the fingers and all of these parts is that we want to take the weight away from the base of the hand, just so that you evenly distribute it and you give your wrists a little bit more support. How wide should the hands be? How long is a piece of string? It really just depends what's comfortable for you. Are you training for anything in particular? You can explore, I would say, do variety, but at least sort of shoulder width normally feels pretty good. And then when the hips are lifted up and back, what we're looking for is length along the spine. So often what we see in downward facing dog is this rounding of the back, and the main reason is that the hamstrings are pulling a little bit on the tail. So the hamstrings attach from your sitting bones to the, they cross over the knee and they attach to the top of the lower leg bone. And when you shorten them, you get knee flexion and hip extension. So that's the hamstring in its shortest phase. So to lengthen the hamstring, you would have hip flexion and knee extension. So when the hamstrings, imagine I'm in my down dog here, so you're in that hip flexion. If the hamstrings are a little bit tight here, they're going to pull underneath, they're going to pull the tail underneath, and then the knock-on effect is a rounding in the lower back. Now, thinking about the hamstrings affecting the pelvis and the knees, one way that we can help to release the pressure on the hamstring is the tucking of the tail. That naturally just ends up happening. And the other way is the bending of the knee. If you were to fully lengthen them, you would stick your tail out and you would straighten your knees. But we can only lengthen the muscle, we can only move the body as much as the muscle wants to lengthen on that given day. So we have to have a little bit of compassion for the time that it'll take our body to find that shape. But when you're in your down dog, knowing that your hamstrings are going to want to tuck your tail under, you've really got to think about sticking your bum up and out. Now I'm exaggerating a little bit so you can really see, but really thinking about journeying the sitting bones up towards the sky, and a bend of the knee is probably really going to help with that. Now, thinking of the domino effect, what often happens when we try to stick our bum out is we end up sticking the ribs out too. So finding that dual action, bum sticks out, ribs draw in. Bum sticks out, ribs draw in. Bum sticks out, ribs draw in. And you can see that my heels are far away from the floor. If you bend your knees, your heels are not going to touch the floor. That's natural. And if you're determined to get your heels down, you're probably going to start to find that it tucks your tail underneath again. So prioritize the sticking out of the bum and the drawing in of the ribs to help you find length all the way down the spine. The arms can be straight, and I know the most popular cue is shoulders away from ears. But when you lift the arms, If you want to get more shoulder flexion, so this is shoulder flexion. If you want to get more shoulder flexion, if you pull the shoulders down away from the ears, you'll feel actually you don't have very much shoulder flexion. And when you try to keep it flexing, you'll end up doing it from the rib cage. If you lift your shoulders up to your ears, you'll discover you have more shoulder flexion. So you have more range of motion when you lift the shoulder and send it back than when you have the shoulder down and you send it back. You can see that? More range when you lift and journey it back. Okay? And there is a difference between on purpose lifting the shoulders to the ears and having them up because you're just really stressed out. And really, if you're going to be stressed out and hold a lot of tension here, it makes sense to strengthen that area anyway, as it's quite hard to relax a muscle if we aren't aware of where it is or what it's doing. So really, I'd say it's a good thing to lift shoulders into the ears, and also it does create more space for all of the structures that are journeying through this shoulder area. It's totally safe and healthy to lift your shoulders into your ears. If you're doing a handstand, you would on purpose lift shoulders into ears and lock elbows. So if you were training for handstand, it would make sense for your down dog to have shoulders and ears and locked elbows. If you want shoulders away from the ears, bring the hands wider, much wider. Just explore that in your own body. Bring your arms close to your head and lift your shoulders into your ears. Keep your arms close to your head and keep your elbows locked and pull your shoulders down, and you'll feel actually it doesn't feel great in your shoulder. Lift your shoulders up to your ears again and start to widen your hands until you naturally feel your shoulders want to drift down. So it's very natural for us to want shoulders away from ears with wider hands, but with hands narrower, it feels better and it gives more space. It makes more sense for the shoulder joint to have shoulders in ears. Also, your lats, your big wing muscles, they attach on to the top of your arm bone, your humerus. And so when you lift your shoulder into your ear, you stretch your lats more. So it's also a really lovely action to do to get that length down the side waist, down the sides of the back. So don't be afraid of pushing shoulders into ears. It's totally natural, useful movement. And one final thing on my shoulders away from ears rant. Your shoulder is made up of your collarbone and your scapula, your shoulder blade, and they come together to make this little shelf here. And underneath that bony shelf articulates your arm bone, your humerus. This shelf here is called the acromion, which is part of the scapula, the shoulder blade. And your arm bone attaches into the shoulder blade. So this whole area all works together. The arm bone, the shoulder blade, the collarbone, it's all totally connected. The space between the shelf, the acromion, and the arm bone, the humerus, is called the subacromial space. And through the subacromial space passes nerves, blood vessels. You have bursa in that area, which are sort of fluid-filled, cushiony sacs. And you also have tendons for muscles, the attachment sites. Tendons attach muscles onto bones. And they pass through that space. When you say arms up, shoulders down, when you lift the arm, your collarbone and your shoulder blade has to lift because they're all attached to the arm. When you keep the arm there and you pull the shoulder down and you get that cue, what you're actually doing is keeping the arm bone lifted but pulling down the collarbone and the scapula. And you pull them down onto the arm bone. So that space, that subacromial space, narrows and impinges. And you could pinch all of those lovely important structures in that area. We see a lot of niggly front of shoulders in the yoga world. Partly it's to do with the rounding of the shoulders in chaturanga. You can go watch my chaturanga tutorial to help you learn how to open your chest in that movement. Partly it's repetitive strain because we do so many of them. And partly it's this arms up, shoulders down. So exploring your down dog, pushing the floor away and letting your shoulders travel into your ears. Let your elbows be straight. You don't have to be fearful of locking your joints if it feels comfortable. Also, explore bending your elbows a little bit and softening them. See which suits your body best. Try having shoulders in ears. Try having shoulders pulled away from ears. Try shoulders halfway. Explore, see what feels best. Remember, anything new might feel challenging, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't feel best. So, we've got fingers spread wide. We're pushing the floor away with the hands. The shoulders may or may not be by the ears. We're sticking out the bum and drawing the ribs in. We know that bending the knees gives a little bit of space to help you lengthen the tops of the hamstrings. And we're not worrying about whether or not the heels are touching the floor. So these are my top tips for downward facing dog. In terms of how far to have the hands from the feet, again, it's really personal preference, but it's very normal to have your hands and feet a different distance in down dog to plank. Now, I've heard this said a lot, or you should have the same distance between plank and down dog. It really just depends on the length of your hamstrings, the mobility of your ankle, the mobility of your wrists, whether you want to focus on stretching your calves or stretching your hamstrings. It really just depends. So rather than following these set rules, have a real sense of play and inquiry around your downward facing dog. And for those of you that are familiar with your down dog, the two things that probably are new for you to explore are shoulders in ears, and give it a really fair whack. Remember, if you've been doing it one way for a long time, it might feel weird, or it might get really fatigued really quickly, but give it a really fair whack. Try it out for a while, a few weeks or so before you decide what's right for you. So shoulders and ears to explore. And then the idea of balancing sticking out your bum with drawing in your ribs. And I would recommend filming your down dog from the side, so the view that you were looking at mine, and seeing how much your bum sticking out affects your lower back, what's going on with your ribs. And then as you draw your ribs in, that also provides a little bit of support for the shoulders. So this action of shoulders in ears, which helps you push the floor away, and drawing in with the ribs, is the opposite of chest coming towards the floor. But just to say, the shoulder blades together and chest to the floor, as in what I'm demoing right now, that's a beautiful version of downward facing dog if you were doing a back bending class and you wanted to use the down dog to help you prep for your back bend. So remember, there's no absolute right or wrongs. It's just understanding for every option, what's the plus point and what might be not the drawback, but is this variation leading to me towards this goal or that goal? So try to start to think of every variation as being good for something. You just have to figure out what each one is good for. And what's good for my body might not be good for your body. So have an explore, freshen it up, and see where you end up.